we publish the debt numbers quarterly, which is why there's a lot of discussion around it. But let me just give some numbers. As at December, you can't hear me, sir?
Okay.
Okay. As at December 2020, the debt stock of Nigeria, and that includes the federal, the state governments, and the Federal Capital Territory, was 32.92 trillion naira. By December 2021, it was 39.556 trillion naira. Okay, as at March of this year, we published quarterly, it was 41.60 trillion naira. Okay, so responding directly to the question, borrowing absolutely.
Sorry to bring you back.
Yes.
As at July, we were where?
No, as at March of this year.
March, okay.
We were at 2022.
Yeah.
So that's the latest. 41.6 trillion naira.
Okay. No, don't worry. Let's talk about the current. 41.6 trillion.
Yes.
For the federation, right?
Yes, federation.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Can you separate federation from the FG from a federating unit?
Okay, I can give you just an average. On the average, the federal government is about 85% of the total.
85%.
Yes, sir. On the average, that's what it is.
No, don't worry, we'll do the math.
If you just apply 50%.
Right, yeah.
What I'm saying is, technically, the bulk of it is the federal government. 85% is federal government. Yes. Okay. And that's if you go all the way from 2017. So we also publish that data, actually, every half yearly to show you what the share of the federal is and the share of the state. Okay, so I think speaking specifically to the question, and it's a genuine concern that Nigerians ask, and you as stakeholders in Nigeria with responsibilities for borrowing as well. Debt has grown, and that has come really from the annual budget. Okay, so there are three levels where those borrowings have increased. We've been running deficit budget for many, many years. Okay, so each time you approve a budget with a deficit, by the time we raise that money, because when you approve it, you've given us a mandate to borrow, authority to borrow, it will reflect in the debt stock. Okay, so debt stock will increase. Also remember that the states are also borrowing, so we add their own to it. They have laws also governing their borrowings. So the second leg to that really is debt stock increases, so does debt service. Okay, so the clear message is go through the budget. We've been borrowing, having deficit budgets for many years and have been borrowing significantly. From COVID 2020, the level of borrowing has increased significantly. As we know, those budgets pass through this house. So the issue is, how do you reduce that debt? One of it is revenues, which you have talked about. Okay, so if revenues are high, your deficit will be lower. Okay, and then your new borrowing will be less. So your debt stock will grow slower and your debt service to revenue will not be so high. So the challenge is, we've been borrowing because of shortfalls. Okay, so the other thing to do is, let's look at our expenditure profile. What can we reduce there? Because you're asking me what is the remedy. It's coming from the budget. There's revenue, there's expenditure listed in various categories, personnel, overhead, and capital. Okay, so those are what bring up the deficit that we borrow for. So it's those things that should be interrogated. What can we do in addition to increasing revenue significantly? Let me say that a World Bank report does show that in terms of debt to GDP ratios, Nigeria is low, but for debt service to revenue ratio, we're very high. So if you look at the revenue to the tax to GDP ratios of these other countries, they're in multiples of Nigeria. The World Bank report did a survey of, I think, about 196 countries, 197 countries. Nigeria is number 195, meaning we beat only 2 countries, and that was Yemen and Afghanistan. I don't think we want to belong to those 2 places. So we can't talk about borrowing without talking about revenues, okay? And we can't say, why is the debt stock growing? It's growing because we are running deficit budgets, and as some of you may be aware also, we are also issuing promissory notes to refinance areas of government, which also come through the National Assembly for approvals. But what we as a DMO have been saying, particularly since 2020, when the MTEP for 2021-2023 was being prepared, is to say, hey, let's begin to look at revenues, because as debt is growing, debt service is increasing. So the language we used was for debt to be sustainable in the medium term. Sustainable means you can service your debt without difficulty without it consuming all your revenues and you have very little for other projects. You must look at revenues very closely, and I think the discussion you've had with customs is on one part of it. There are many other revenue generating agencies. So we must increasingly begin to look at revenue for funding our activities as opposed to deficit. Okay, we talked about 11 trillion deficit and borrowing for 2023. How much is the revenue there? That's one. Okay, so when we looked at the first draft, that was 10 trillion for full year deficit for full year of subsidy and 9 trillion for 6 months of subsidy next year. The size of the borrowing was 60% of the budget, 62% of the budget. I mean, that's high. So the responsibilities, I think, are on both sides. Query the various expenditure lines and see what it is we can handle. So if the deficit is lower, the borrowing will be lower, and that stock will grow on a slower pace. Okay, so like you said, so I've just said what the sources of those debt is and the need to focus on revenue. We did say this in 2020 at a public hearing in the National Assembly, and if you've listened to us, we've been talking about it a lot. Revenue can't grow at very low rates of 2% or 3%. It has to grow significantly to be able to ensure that we can service our debt and still have funds for capital projects, for other overheads and important activities. So that's, I would say that is what it is. So debt service grows because debt stock grows. So are we concerned about debt service to revenue? Of course we are, but we always say that when you've incurred debt that is approved, you have to service it. It's not a grant. So debt service is an obligation. So we have to look at revenues. Thank you. I'll wait. Yeah.
Okay, you are done?
Yeah, waiting for, maybe you have follow-up questions. We attempt to answer it. When you are reviewing the MTEP 2023 to 2025, you will look at those details, because the real issue is what expenditure items will you reduce, take away there or reduce? How will we generate more revenues to ensure that we don't get a deficit? Okay, so I think that's where we have to be. But let me answer your question. So you are correct in the sense that the World Bank and the IMF, who typically set standards and use these standards to measure so that countries can be benchmarked. Okay, for countries like Nigeria, meaning we, Egypt, Kenya, and some other countries in Asia and other parts, their advice or recommendation is that your debt to GDP ratio, meaning that total debt to GDP, should not exceed 55%. They didn't specify a ratio for debt service to revenue ratio. But let me explain that 55% to 55% of debt stock to GDP. I believe they stopped at that ratio because they expect that the other component, which is revenue, will be growing. And from the data that is available, you will see that all those countries, including Kenya, for instance, which is in Africa, they have higher debt to GDP ratio than Nigeria, but their debt service to revenue ratio is much lower than that of Nigeria because they are generating revenues. So the World Bank prescribed that ratio, total debt to GDP. Okay, what we in Nigeria have done under the medium-term debt management strategy is to even say our own limit is 40%. It shouldn't be 55% because we are not generating so much revenues, okay, to service it, because it's not GDP that you will carry and say, let me use it to pay for the debt. Okay, so we understand a bit about indeed all financial institutions, if you want to borrow, they have to look at your ability to repay, which is your cash flow or revenue, salary, whatever it is. So that's a valid argument, but that's where we are here. So we do an annual debt sustainability, and we advise the government. So I think to enable us to serve Nigerians better and to enable us to be more effective, we need to begin to look at those things that give rise to the debt stock. It doesn't just happen. It happens from the budget. It happens from the budget. So even if we say, for instance, don't borrow, it means you don't have to look at the budget. How can I make it a balanced budget? As you know, countries can run balanced budget, meaning expenditure is equal to revenue. Surplus, meaning revenue is higher than expenditure, or deficit. But we have been running deficit budget for decades. For decades. Okay, so I will stop there. Right? Yes. No, I think she asked a very appropriate question. So we'll answer it again in two parts. I think we should be fair to ourselves as people serving Nigeria. To say that we can't see what we use the borrowing for may not exactly be true. If you look at the airports, how many do you have? You have a new international airport in Abuja, you have Lagos, you have the modernizations in Kano, even Enugu that is now international. Those came from borrowings. The rail lines have also come from borrowings. Okay, so it's not that it is a zero performance. So, no, you can feel them. You can feel them. You can also see. I'm sorry. Yes. So what I'm saying is, there are things when people talk like that. No, yes. No, excuse me. No, see, your airports in other countries, your airports generate significant revenues. The rail lines are supposed to transport people and goods. Abroad, you know how much you pay when you take the London Underground or you take a train from London to... You know what you pay. So those things generate revenues in those other countries. What is subsidized, they know it in the rural areas. So those things... An airport is not just somewhere to travel. The international airports you see abroad, they have, apart from what you pay inside your ticket, all those shops that we patronize, they pay taxes and all kinds of things to government. Okay, apart from rent that they pay. So we have those projects, we have airports, and it's not just this one in Abuja. We have, no, okay, so we have rails, then let's just use one. At least there are some you have seen. You have seen the Sukuk, which is a project-tied borrowing. You've seen those ones. It works. We don't pay the contractors. DG,
you've made a very good